I'm Nancy Horowitz. I'm the director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you. At the Elie Wiesel Center, we are offering educational events to help us understand the complexities and the nuances of the situations we're finding ourselves in today. Can we learn to avoid binary oppositions? In other words, one way or the other way, no nuance, no subtlety. These binary oppositions can lead to conflict, even among ourselves. What are the tensions at play, and how do we overcome them? How do we recognize, acknowledge, and then act on our shared humanity? I don't think anyone would disagree with the statement that we're living in very difficult times. We've seen and are still seeing a precipitous rise in anti-Semitism, anti-Israeli bias, Islamophobia, and other forms of hatred almost everywhere we look. I'm grateful, very grateful, that Professor Troen took time out of his very hectic schedule to speak to us today. He's a world-renowned scholar in Israel studies with a deep interest in developing this field, which you'll hear he's done an incredible amount of work in, and an expert on the history of the war and the conflict. He's professor emeritus of the Sam and Anna Lopin Chair of Modern History at the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. He's also professor emeritus of the Carl, Harry, and Helen Stoll Chair in Israel Studies at Brandeis. He was the founding director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis and the founding academic director of the Ben-Gurion Research Institute for the Study of Israel and Zionism. He is a past president of the Association for Israel Studies, from which he received its Lifetime Achievement Award in 2023. A founding editor of the journal Israel Studies and the book series Perspectives on Israel Studies at Indiana University Press, he's authored or edited numerous books in American, Jewish, and Israeli history. His new book, which we're going to hear about this evening, is entitled Israel-Palestine in World Religions, Whose Promised Land? It was awarded the 2024 Bernard Lewis Prize in November at the annual conference of the Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa. This award singles out Professor Troen's contributions to understanding the relationships between Jews and Israel and sister civilizations based on Christianity and Islam. He's a native of Boston and was educated at the Boston Latin School, the Prosder program at the College of Hebrew College, BA from Brandeis, and his PhD from University of Chicago. He made Aliyah in 1975 with his wife, Dr. Carol Troen, who is an expert in linguistics and an artist. They make their home in Omer, a garden suburb of Beersheba, where they brought up their 6 children. Tragically, their daughter, Deborah, and son-in-law, Shlomi, were murdered on October 7th on their kibbutz Holit in the Gaza envelope. The Troens take comfort in their 5-generational family that lives in Israel from the Golan Heights through the Negev. After the talk, Dr. Matthew Creighton, who is the Associate Director of the Elie Wiesel Center, will present a short response to Professor Troen's talk. Dr. Creighton holds a PhD also from the University of Chicago and teaches Jewish studies as well as Holocaust studies for our programs. There will be time for questions from the audience, and a reception will follow. One thing I'd like to add that on top of all the events that Professor Albie Gilman has been organizing on Israel Studies in order to launch our new Israel Studies minor, we're also offering 5 sections of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict course this year. 2 this semester, 3 next semester, in order to respond to the need for education on the conflict. I'd like to thank the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs at Pardee for their co-sponsorship of this event, and Professor Jeremy Menchik, as well as Dr. Gilman, who I already thanked. We have 5 Israel Studies events this year. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ilan Troen.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank all of those who braved the cold to come out and hear me. Coming from the Negev, you have no idea how I value your bravery with what you have to encounter here. There is a special pleasure in being here. I've been in this room before to hear Elie Wiesel, and it was always a highlight of our sojourns in Boston to hear that great individual and to meet him and to speak under the rubric of a center named for him is a singular honor. I'm also very pleased that Cura is involved in this. I have to tell you a bit about the book. It's kind of I feel like a German academic about to give a prolegomena to an introduction, and then I'll finally get to what it is that I have to say. But the book was inspired by what I learned at Cura. Cura, in my day, I had the good luck of sometimes walking this campus where I studied French, by the way, not with particularly great success, but I was glad to be here, so I knew where the Sherman Hall was and where the entertainment was and where the gym is and a few other places. And I used to even go to Braves baseball games when I was a kid. For those of you who are not historians of Boston, there used to be a baseball team here that played in BU Field. In my presence here, I met one of the great sociologists of religion of these generations, and it was Peter Berger. Peter Berger passed some 10 years ago, and he was a legend and I met him at a time of his life where he was considering doing something that I know very few academics ever do, which is after you gain worldwide reputation for one discovery, you come around at another stage in your life and you say, well, I wasn't quite right. It's like, I don't know, saying Newtonian, after the apple falls on your head once, you say, but if it falls again, it's not gonna work the same way. He gained he gained fame in the 1960s for arguing that modernity inexorably led to secularism. When I met him, he was considering that was not necessarily true, that it was entirely possible, probable, in fact, actual, that you could have modernity and still have people quite devoted, deeply devoted to religious beliefs. And even beyond that, it was possible for individuals to be modern and some part of their ways in which they perceive the world have an epistemology, a way of knowing things that were secular, and other ways of knowing things that drew upon traditional religious sources. And it was that Peter Berger that I met, and over a number of years, he invited in on a regular basis scholars from China to the Soviet Union, across Europe, Latin America, who all came to give testimony that his initial statement had to be modified, and that we ought to look at phenomena in where secularism and religion could actually coexist. And it was that insight that forms the basis of the book that I have to give you. Secondly, I've spent most of my career teaching in Israel, and I see a colleague from Israel here, and good to see you, Nachum. But I would not have written the book had I not come to America. At Brandeis, most of my students, actually numerically the majority, were non-Jews. And it was interesting to teach Israel to non-Jews as opposed to teaching a mixture of bourgeois Jews from North Tel Aviv, kibbutzniks, who were somewhat to the left, to right-wing settlers, in a class that also had Bedouins and people of other kinds of persuasions. It was certainly would satisfy any DEI official, but the mix in the United States was different. I had a good many Christians and some Muslims, people from Egypt, and Mormons, evangelicals, Roman Catholics, Protestants of various denominations, and the like. And what I found so fascinating is that they were looking at the Holy Land through a different lens, and I can explain that lens very briefly. I hope you all know, or someday will read, Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad, published in 1869. Innocents Abroad is a book that I think Mark Twain used to finance his travels from Europe through the Mediterranean. He got paid by the word. And there's a fabulous chapter there on what he encounters, in the Holy Land. And the most dramatic scene are two stalwart fellows with a pole on their shoulder, and carrying that pole carries very large objects that look like grapefruit. But the label underneath says Sunday school grapes. And that's the humor. After all, it's Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. And in the background is a desert. So what are these Sunday school grapes of enormous size doing in the desert? And then he explains in the text, these are the grapes that I imagined existed in the Holy Land as I grew up and going to a Sunday school in Hannibal, Missouri. That was the message. And it's the message to you, and it's the message to anybody who reads my book. We all come from a Hannibal, Missouri. The way in which we perceive the Holy Land is through the particular Sunday school we went to at our church, our mosque, our synagogue. Give you another example, and then I'll begin where I should begin. I had a student, a brilliant Protestant student from Indiana. Father was a minister who was a backpacker and did the Appalachian Trail many times. When he got to Palestine, Israel, he used to do the Israel Trail and used to visit as guests. And from him I learned, we're very interested in seeing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. On the other hand, Protestants wanted to see Gethsemane, and neither were interested in what the other wanted to see. And then you learn that there are trails for settlers, for non-settlers, for people who have very different political and theological views of the meaning of Palestine, Israel, and to whom the land belongs. It's another way of reaffirming that there are prisms through which we examine this particular country. And in some way or another, I wanted to capture the multiplicity of prisms in the book that I present to you. Israeli, and that I am fully committed to the legitimacy of my country and troubled by the attacks of illegitimacy that it has to endure. As a particular point that was added after October 7th, which is to say, I finished writing it in October, gave it to the publisher, and then asked for it back on October 8th. And the reason was, as noted, my daughter and son-in-law, who were members of a kibbutz on the southern part of the Gaza envelope, were murdered that morning of October 7th. And I had to some way frame the beginning and frame the end that would take account of it. And the way I did it was to relate it to this introduction that I'm telling you, because I needed to understand, and I don't think I solved the problem, by the way, understand how those who are devoted to universal values of universal rights and principles of justice can be so supportive of a murderous, barbaric, fundamentalist religious group that invokes the name of God in order to commit their acts. How does one mix that particular kind of oil with water, that linen with cotton? What happens? This is far more extreme than anything I heard with Peter Berger. And so I have not been able to solve it completely, but I do appreciate that people can live with dichotomies. I think there's a school of thought that will label this dissonance, cognitive dissonance of one sort or another. We live in a world that's full of it when it relates to Israel. So that's the prolegomena and the introduction, and let me get to the basic stuff. Claims to the Holy Land in the contemporary period are done in a very particular way, and let me frame it as a historian. Until 1917 and the Balfour Declaration, claims to the Holy Land were largely voiced and made in theological terms. After all, the country had been ruled by Jews, by Christians, and by Muslims, and for 13 centuries largely 13 centuries by Muslims, and several centuries before that by Christians. And in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, one of the largest empires ever to exist on the face of the earth, the British Empire, in which the sun never set, decided that this land would be transferred to Jews. Wow, what a shock that was to Christians, Jews, and Muslims. How do you change that order? How do you explain it? Well, there may be one way of explaining it through shock, negation, rarely affirmation in the church, the mosque or the synagogue. But how do you explain it when you go to the League of Nations and later on the United Nations, or you go to the public square, or you write a book for the Academy? The modern world has an entirely different discourse than the kind of word or the kind of discourse that exists before the 20th or certainly the 19th century. What one has to do is to somehow adapt, refine, complement, find the means to change the discourse. And my question really is, are these discourses, the traditional theological and the modern secular, entirely different? Can they support one another? Do they complement one another? Or are they necessarily in contradiction? So that's what this is all about. Thus, I already told you, secular supporters of Hamas declaratively favor universal rights, but support religious fundamentalists, and so on. Is colonial settler really a secular term, or is it some way related to replacement theology? You will hear from me that it's very deeply related to replacement theology. When you say Arab land or Jewish land, is that a secular or a religious statement? And so on. Well, let me begin then with an analysis of the discourse and a few words about the secular discourse. Secular discourse is really a phenomenon that begins in the Enlightenment. John Locke tells us how one claims land. The nut gatherer can make some claims. Shepherd can claim it more because he invests labor, and the farmer, by the sweat of his brow, invests even more labor and has therefore a greater claim. So goes the theory. But if you want to read consistent theories of land, read the Americans. The Americans had that problem. When they first came here, the Mayflower Compact is a religious document. It's not unlike one would find if one were Jewish and one would read Rashi's commentary. Rashi, who lived 1,000 years ago in France, explained why the Bible begins, and in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and he tells us it was to show that the earth is the Lord, and he assigns it to whoever he decides or she decides to whom it belongs, and that anybody who decides otherwise can be counted among the listim, which means they're pirates. So God determines to whom the land belongs. And even as rulers rule by divine right, so do claims to land base their justification on divine will. That's the way people thought for millennia, not just in Europe, not just the monotheistic cultures. So by the 19th century, that just doesn't work. If you're Thomas Jefferson, John Marshall, if you're joining the Western movement, or if you're going across new territories, how do you claim land? And John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, has actually outlined a detailed system of ascertaining how Americans justified their seizure of this continent. And it is the basis of international law today. One, conquest was legitimate until around 1940 in the formation of the documents that created the United Nations. It was there for the first time that on an international basis, aggressive behavior was not sufficient for taking somebody else's land. Now, the document was written in English, not in Chinese or in Russian, and it has had limited effect, but it explains how Americans thought that had they joined the League of Nations, contrary to Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, we would have had a mandate too. It would have been Armenia. So there would have been the French mandates and the British mandates, and there would have been an American mandate over Armenia. Maybe how lucky for everybody that that did not work out. If you have conquest, you have treaties. You write up what the conquest is. Discovery and rediscovery, who gets to the North Pole first, to the bottom of the sea, to the planets. Labor, we just discussed. Purchase, you can buy Manhattan, Louisiana, Alaska, and heaven knows what else. All this enters into the discourse of how largely Europeans claimed taking land from natives. In the 20th century, there's a different kind of discourse that Justice Marshall never entertained, but in my estimation becomes far more important and the source of political and polemical debate today, and is through the use of history and terms out of which comes notions like indigeneity, anti-colonialism, and the idea of a colonial settler. Self-determination is also a brand new idea. It comes with Wilson and his principles articulated at the First World War. In short, something new happens. And after the Balfour Declaration, all of these get factored into the kind of discourse that members of the three different monotheisms have to take into account. There's the quote from Rashi. I already said it. And what I find so fascinating, and it really goes to what I learned from Peter Berger. What's interesting is that the single largest issue by volume of words written, spoken, argued, was over the issue of how many people Palestine could sustain. Because if it couldn't sustain enough, there would be no room for Jews to legitimately come into the country. And if that were the case, then the Balfour Declaration would be null and void and actually a cause for illegitimacy. And if you look at the argument and who supports the arguments, and we're talking about archaeologists, historians, geologists, natural scientists of all sorts, the literature is vast and goes across all the disciplines within the university. And what one finds, a divide. And the divide is based upon how people assess the evidence. Guess what? Proponents of the Palestinian Arab cause accepted the notion that there were already too many people in Palestine and that therefore there ought to be a limit on how many more people could come in, especially if they were of a different culture. Supporters of Zionism said, what are you talking about? There were far more people here in the past than there are in the present. This country's economic absorptive capacity is enormous. So is the issue scientific and objective, or is the issue cultural and rooted in the kind of filter everybody finds in their Sunday school in Hannibal? So this is an interesting bit of information. This is a table of the actual population of Palestine. There were far more people in Palestine at the time of Jesus. There were far more people at the time of the Byzantine Empire. Look at the figures. I don't know if my finger is going to work. Whoops, it clearly didn't. So I'll use the pointer. I was brought up, you don't point. It's right, it's impolite. Forgive me. Dad, forgive me. So that's the lowest figure for the time of Jesus. We're talking here also around the Byzantine period. There's first a Jewish majority, then a Christian majority. And after the 6th century, which is not represented here, it begins to become a Muslim territory. What's fascinating is that how many people lived in Palestine at the time of the Balfour Declaration? 700,000. How many people live in Palestine, Israel today? 14 million. The country grew 20 times in a century. Phenomenal growth with a standard of living that was most believed was unattainable a century ago. So who was right? We know what the scientific answer is today. But one would still have contended on different sides based upon positions. But what's even more interesting, for centuries, indeed more than half a millennia, the population of Palestine was under 200,000. So my question is, and I understand it's a political question, it's not why weren't there more Jews in Palestine, nor is it a question of why weren't there more Christians in Palestine. The question is, why weren't there more Muslims in Palestine? It was a severely underpopulated country. And that would be rectified only in the past century. It would again become a land flowing with milk and honey. All right, so what does one learn? These facts, this information, the contention of this information becomes crucial to arguments over indigeneity. We have been here the longest, but in fact, at no time were there no Jews, no Christians, and after Muhammad, no Muslims. But the majority, the flow between the different groups changes over time, and one could make all kinds of historical statements, even as I just did, using raw data. So know that I have a filter on what I shared with you. That's my Sunday school. But nevertheless, one could well imagine other filters. Well, the whole idea of indigeneity was imported in a place where it may have been appropriate to a place where it may be less appropriate, and I think it's decidedly less appropriate in the Middle East, in much of Africa, in much of Europe. For the notion of indigeneity began in Central America as good-intentioned progressives wished to defend the rights of people whose culture and whose economic system was harmed by Columbus, the world that Columbus brought to their territory. But and those were considered indigenous. It would take another 50 years from 1960 to 2007 for the United Nations to have a declaration of indigenous rights. Now note that it's a declaration and not a treaty, and that's because who could agree? Would the Canadians agree to surrender their rights to the First Peoples? Would the Australians agree to surrender their rights of sovereignty to the Aborigines? Would the Americans agree to surrender their rights, maybe for a pipeline through the Dakotas, to the native Indians there? So this whole issue is a political issue, but what we know of history, of the written record, who are the original people of Spain, of Catalonia, of Belgium? It's a mess. And the mess in the contemporary world is when we try to put artificial political borders among populations who are mixed and for which there may be a majority and minority, but there's certainly no exclusive homogeneity. So who is native in the Levant? That is an interesting issue. And what one finds is as this argument develops, all kinds of people claim curious indigeneity. Lebanon's Maronites invent the story that they are descendants of the ancient Phoenicians. The Copts skip over Islam and see themselves as the authentic descendants of the pharaohs. The Turks go, and I've been there, to the National Museum in Ankara. I can't go there anymore for reasons that I suspect most of you know. But if you would go to the National Museum of Ankara, the first large rooms are full of magnificent Hittite archaeology. And by the way, it's very germane, because if you went to synagogue like I did on the Sabbath, you read about the Hittites who sold a cave to Abraham for burial purposes. The Hittites actually existed, and they are now claimed by the Turks, secular Turks, not necessarily the current regime, as their forebearers. This whole notion of indigeneity expanded after 1967 with the death and defeat of Nasser and Pan-Arabism, of one Arab people from the Mediterranean through the Persian Gulf. With his demise, other people decided that they needed too to anchor their national identity in local history. The Hashemites at the Dinar in Jordan, after 67, has a picture of Hussein with one arm over Petra and the other arm over Al-Aqsa. He's the patron of the holy places of the Nabateans and of Islam, which is appropriate. If you're a Hashemite, you are a protector of holy places. And if the Hashemites were better fighters, we'd talk about Hashemite Arabia rather than Saudi Arabia. But what to do? The British moved them, and they had to establish themselves and create a new identity. The Palestinians all of a sudden decide that they are Jebusites. Who are the Jebusites? Those are the people David conquered as he took Jerusalem some 3,000 or so years ago. The exact date cannot be determined, but roughly around that time. The Jebusites have been kept alive not in Arabic, but have been kept alive in Hebrew prayer. Those of you who know the Aleinu talk about the Perizi, the Chiti, and the Yevusi. And throughout the prayer, there are references to Jebusites. They live in the Hebrew prayer 3-4 times a day. Christians, this is fascinating, we'll come to this a little bit later, decided that they were descended without interruption from the early Christians who accepted Jesus. And quoting Peter 1, chapter 2, verse 5, they are the living stones on which the new church will be built. And if you look for the proof, it comes from the name of the person who invented this, Naim Atik. Atik in Arabic means ancient. Atik in Hebrew also means ancient. All right. What this goes to is another Palestinian liberation theologian, Mitri Rahib, a Lutheran from Bethlehem, who invented a word which is very, very apt for my purposes and hopefully for your understanding. He talks about a paradigm shift, and he uses the word theopolitics. Indeed, that's what's going on here. There is politics rooted in theology and in other aspects which underlie the way in which, in some cases, indigeneity is framed. So, the Zionist claim, those of you who know the Declaration of Independence, the first chapter, the first paragraph, talks about they wrote and gave the Bible to the world here. Of course, they did it Mount Sinai. There was some Jewish experience in the Fertile Crescent, and Jews also lived in many places outside, but that's the national narrative. Palestinian equivalent, the Palestinian National Charter. We are the Palestinian Arabs in Israel, the indigenous peoples, the residents of the states of Israel, and so on. Notice the use of the word peoples, that we are a people with deep roots and part of this transnational people from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. And I'm going to do something not fair. I'm not going to let you read this because I'm going to go very quickly to the next slide because I want to get to theology. All Abrahamic religions, there's no such thing as a Jewish position on who claims and how claims can be made concerning the Holy Land. The same holds for Islam and the same holds for Christianity. All have multiple strands. All these strands somehow become articulated, strengthened, institutionalized over the past century as the struggle over the Holy Land takes the new form of not merely being dormant theological statements, but actually being fought out in the academy and the public square and in international institutions. For Judaism, we know more or less where the place is, aside from some people who think that it ought to go to El Arish, it ought to go to the Litani, maybe even to Mesopotamia. but the borders are more or less clear, both sides of the Jordan for some, one side for others. The issue of boundaries is contentious, but more contentious is the issue of when the promise may be fulfilled and by whom. Famous story. A gentleman by the name of Hanan Porat, who was the head of Gush Emonim, the major settler movement, debating with Avi Ravitsky, the head of the Department of Jewish Thought of the Hebrew University at an institution in Jerusalem called Van Leer. And Ravitsky, and Hanan Porat gets up and says, you know, as a religious Jew, I believe that the Messiah will come. And indeed, that's part of the prayer service, reiterated many times during the day for millennia. I believe the Messiah is going to come, and when he comes, it will be to institute a law, the law of the Torah, halakha. Now, when Ravitsky heard that, he got up and said, you know, my friend Avi, I agree with you. The Messiah is going to come. And this country will someday be ruled by this religious law. The difference between us is you know when that time is and by whom it's going to come about. So Hanan Porat became a settler and part of the right-wing coalitions in Israel. Avi Ravitsky became a member of the Labor Party and asked for compromise because he didn't know when it was, until the good time comes, one must live in this world, and a measure of pragmatism is certainly to be permitted. That's my point. One could take the same text, the same principles, and interpret them in multiple ways. The Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, waiting for the Messiah. Religious Jews, I just explained. In America, Reform Judaism was anti-Zionist until around the 1930s and decidedly pro-Zionist after the Second World War. And Brit Shalom, Martin Buber was certainly a religious and a learned Jew. He argued that we can only take the land ethically, and that can only be done by having one state for both peoples. So the political possibilities are multiple. Christianity is more interesting. They have more power than Jews have, and they were really the key actors. The issues are written above there. I could read them from my screen. Does God still speak to the Jews? It's the question of the New Testament, of the new church. Are the old covenants broken? Are they fulfilled or not to be fulfilled? Is there a new covenant? Is the church the new Israel? Did the coming of Jesus abrogate those covenants? Do the Jews still have a role in history? And if so, what may it be? Do they still have a connection to the promised land? And what may it be? How you decide these questions as a Christian will inform the politics towards a Jewish state. Let me give you an example. The key statement and the key actor here for my particular story is St. Augustine, who formulates supersessionism. Not a surprising document for somebody who, a monotheist. Excuse me? You can't hear me? No? All right. It's usually at this point that I say, but I have 6 children and I learned how to raise my voice. All right? All right. That's my wife giving me instructions in case none of you know. All right. Monotheism, by definition, believes in one Lord, one deity who supersedes all others. And so naturally, the God of the Christians, Jesus, would supersede the God of the Jews, even as Abraham, broke the idols in his father's house, and Muhammad would become the last of the prophets. Supersessionism or replacement theology is inherent in monotheism. Polytheism does not have that kind of problem. And the famous story is up on the screen here when Herzl came to Pope Pius X in 1904. Pope Pius essentially responds to him, "What? You expect me, a follower of St. Augustine, to approve the Zionist project? If you dare to send a lot of Jews to Palestine, I will send a lot of priests to convert the Jews, because it would be an affront to have this country populated by those who denied and maybe even killed our Savior. Then how do you explain, and this gets to the guts of the story, how do you explain Pope Francis at Yad Vashem in 2000 standing contrite before the flame, the eternal light, for the young people for the people who were killed in the Holocaust? My point is, something is going to happen in Protestantism, in many of its denominations. Something most certainly happens in Catholicism, even as Jews are going to have to contend with a new reality, and even as Islam is going to have to contend with a new reality that will force fundamental changes in theology. So here's a brief sketch. We already talked about Pope Pius X. My best example is Pope Paul VI, comes for 11 hours to Palestine, never once acknowledges that the president of Israel is the president of Israel. He's rather part of that bland group called the authorities, who bring him with bread and salt. But Pope Paul II comes in 2000, and he fully acknowledges the reality of a Jewish state. Something happens in the 20th century. And even beyond that, there are many Catholics who are displeased with Pope Paul because they want him to go further and argue that God is capable of having more than one covenant. There can be multiple covenants. The covenant of with the Jews may still be extant, even as there is a new covenant which can produce the new church. Interesting. It's a lot of turmoil and a lot of very finely tuned debate. Whoops. And this is just, I'm going to skip that. Evangelicals, we know about that. Huckabee is going to be the new ambassador to Israel, isn't he? And he comes from a tradition that really took vitality after the 67 war. The roots of it are found in 19th century England, and it's found in words like restore, the restoration of the Jews. But if you want to get everything in the best shorthand that I know, look on YouTube to the ceremony that was enacted when the embassy was moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and you will find that the initial invocation was given by Pastor Jeffries of the American Southern Baptist Church of Dallas, 16,000 members, and the concluding benediction was given by Pastor Hagee of the 22,000-member Cornerstone Church. There were no rabbis there. No, there was a cameo shot for a Lubavitch rabbi. There were no priests. There were no Catholics. There were no other Christian religions represented. Trump's decision was a decision that was based upon his connection to his desire to please American evangelicals, fundamentalists, pre-millenarians. And they created kufi. When you get out of a plane in Lod Airport or Tel Aviv Airport and go through the sleeve, you will see pictures of the Ecksteins and people who belong to kufi, and of money given by Christians to help Jews who are in need, who are in trouble, who want to build whatever it is they need to build. They give more money than any Jewish federation in this country to the state of Israel. So that's one interesting change. The most important person, however, in my estimation historically, is Reinhold Niebuhr. He follows, as so many other American Protestants do, on initiatives that began in England. Great Britain exports much to this country, not only a language, which I naturally corrupt, but they export religious revivals and all kinds of ideas and aesthetics. The initial one is Parks. James Parks, who in the 1920s begins to think in terms of a double covenant, one for Jews and one for Christians, and I see as a Judaism and Christianity as equals. That is a revolutionary idea. Nobody is saying that before the 20th century that I know of. This begins to become a possible theological position in the modern world. But why is Niebuhr so important? Niebuhr is probably, you all know of Billy Graham. Niebuhr was far more important than Billy Graham in many ways. Niebuhr was chosen to be the cover of Time magazine's 25th year anniversary issue. He was a member of the Americans for Democratic Action. He was the counselor to presidents all the way up to Obama. He had a theology that was not based upon an acceptance or rejection of supersessionism, but it was based on the very Christian notion of sin. And if you were a college student at Boston University in the 1950s or 60s, and you studied sociology, history, or philosophy, you would be carrying, I would bet that you would be carrying around one of the publications by Reinhold Niebuhr that dealt with the problem of morality, immoral man and immoral society, or moral man in immoral society. And the question was, how does one overcome sin? And his answer was, as a kind of social gospeler, is that the responsibility of a Christian was to reform the world and to seek justice. And as he understood the role of Christianity, it is related to the Holocaust, is that it is the anti-Semitism of the Christian church that needed to be addressed. What's fascinating about him is that he also respected Arab-Palestinian rights and was very much concerned about the refugee problem. But he argued that in this world, which is imperfect, somebody's rights have to have priority, and he prioritized the rights of Jews who needed a state for their own safety. His became the view of a very large Christian establishment in the United States. It's not the Jewish lobby. That's silly. As Walter Mersheimer would have us, there aren't enough of them, and they don't have enough money, and they don't have enough power. It was the Christian world itself that's decided it. Consider this picture. The person who decided that there would be a Jewish state would be Harry Truman, a Baptist from Missouri. Now, there's a large literature which I find inconclusive. Well, the reason that Truman decided to recognize the state of Israel almost immediately after the Declaration of Independence was announced was because his partner was Eddie Jacobson, maybe. Or because there were a lot of wealthy Jews around Central Park, maybe. Or the Jewish vote in Dearborn, Michigan, or its equivalent. Maybe. But what's fascinating, that from what the literature that I know, there's no real agreement among the scholars. He doesn't tell us about his role and why he decided to deny the Secretary of State, George Marshall. And the Pentagon and the State Department were adamant against the division of Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state. But he nevertheless decided for it. After the event, he gave his picture to this book, I Am Cyrus. So what do? Play couch psychiatrist and say, the underlying motive is that he imagined himself living through a biblical narrative that was deeply embedded, maybe in his experiences in Hannibal. Well, he did live on the other side of the state in Kansas City, Missouri. All right, Islam. Islam is easy to deal with. Most of us, and I usually get, and maybe I'll get it tonight, somebody will get up and say, you don't understand. Islam is a religion of violence. It's murder, it's mayhem. It's the Taliban, it's the Hamas, it's the Hezbollah, it's Iran. And if you want to make that case, you can go into Islamic theology and discuss the binary of abodes, the abode of Islam and the abode of war. And they ruled the country, after all, for 13 centuries, except that brief period of the Crusades when they had when the Christians had tenuous control. So is that the only thing that one can say about Islam? If that's true, how do you explain this? How in the name of heaven, whosever heaven you decide, does Sadat come to Jerusalem in 1977 and say, no more war. I recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state. Where does that come from? How does it arrive at that? He just didn't come of his own free will. He came with a document. The document was called a fatwa. It is a religious document that gives a theological justification for that courageous political decision. And there is one small section of a fascinating document of what the theology of Islam can be if you so choose. And it essentially says, if people do not make war against you, you may make peace with them. What it doesn't say in the short snippet, also, if it's to our advantage, like if they give back the Sinai, like if they didn't destroy the 10th Army, like if they engage in a whole variety of other acts, if it's to our advantage, we can make a treaty with them and we can engage with them. What isn't in the document is the reality. If you've got a lot of petrodollars, you have to invest them somewhere, and that somewhere is largely the West. So you're thinking of a world that's divided, a rigid dichotomy between Islam and the rest of the world, and you must make war against it. It's not practical. It's not real. You become integrated into the modern world. Whatever the reason is, the theological statements can be found, and they were found. And Sadat accepted them, made them his own, and he paid for his life for making the choice that he chose. But he could do it, and he's not alone. This is what he had to go against. This is the Hamas Charter: obliterate Israel. Muslims fight Jews and kill them. Jihad. You can have a treaty. It's merely temporary. Peace with a Jewish state is not a theological possibility. But there's more to it than that, because we're also living through a time where we have peace agreements. Jordan, Egypt, and possibly, maybe even Saudi Arabia. The Abraham Accords, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. What I find most moving and most pertinent is that within Israel, the leader of the Israeli Islamic movement joined the government before Netanyahu, the Bennett government, and makes statements explaining why he, as a religious believing Muslim, can actually become a loyal member of a Jewish state. The document is worthwhile reading. I don't know if I should read it out to you. You can all read it off the screen. But it's a statement of affirmation of his willingness to live in a Jewish dominated in terms of national character, society. So how does that happen over the last century, given all the wars and given all the rhetoric? I'm going to skip over this because we need time. But there is constant change. What I'd like to suggest is that's not me. There's constant change and movement, and some of it is unpredictable. Much of it depends upon the choices that individuals and collections of individuals make. We're getting to the end here. This current government in Israel has made an affirmation which is really extraordinary because it's out of the tradition of Zionism since its earliest years. Its guiding principles, written into the formal arrangements for creating the current coalition, say, the Jewish people have an exclusive and indisputable right to all parts of the land of Israel. The government will promote and develop settlement in all parts of the land of Israel, the Galilee, the Negev, the Golan, and Judea and Samaria. The basis for this comes out of a deep commitment to theology. So what do we have here? A fascinating event. You will not find God referenced in Israel's Declaration of Independence. Weizmann, Jabotinsky, Ben-Gurion fought the good fight and fought the battle for the legitimacy of a Jewish state without reference to theology. But they used the kinds of arguments used in the modern secular world. They used the arguments that were developed in international secular discourse, and they did a pretty good job. They won the recognition of 164 states that have relations with Israel. It's part of the United Nations. Lots of votes go against them, to be sure, but they're there. The state of Israel does exist, and it is legitimate on many levels, and particularly on a secular level that people of different religions can accept. But what would have happened if the original argument for a Jewish state would have been made solely in theological terms? My argument, or my position, it never would have come into being. There are just too few of them. The world would not have permitted it. That because there were Jews, or a handful of Jews in Palestine who believe this is ours because God, my God, gave it to us. The case has to be made tenable in the public square. And there's something that goes to it, and I'm going to conclude with this observation. It's fascinating that the first debate that took place in the Zionist Congress in Basel, over which Herzl superintended, was over what the language would be in the four principles on which the Zionist movement would be based. And the first debate was over Zionism seeks to secure for the Jewish people a publicly recognized, legally secured homeland in Palestine. The word in the original German was öffentlich, or openly, which is now translated as publicly. There was no chance, as I've just suggested, that public affirmation of Jewish exclusive rights could have been agreed to. The majority voted to endorse this. The minority came along and agreed, and there was ultimately consensus, unanimity among the delegates to the Jewish Congress. But that argument, though that issue is still alive, on what basis not only do Jews, but do Muslims or any other group make claims to a land for which so much is invested emotionally, historically, theologically, in terms of rights by so many different people? How does one untie this Gordian knot and create a place where people can actually live? The one suggestion that has still on the international agenda, whatever we read about polls accepted or not accepted, was made by the British in 1937 when they argued for partition. And what's interesting is that that partition plan became law in 1947 with the United Nations vote on partition. And what they voted for, please bear in mind, was not a Jewish and democratic state, a Jewish and a Muslim state. They voted for a Jewish, Muslim, and Christian state. Like Gaul, and like anything Hegelian, and other things fundamentally Christian, Palestine was to be divided into three parts: a Jewish part, a Muslim part, and the international zone around Jerusalem and Bethlehem was really to serve the interests of the Christian community, the world Christian community. That was the original partition plan. And to use the words that were used in 1937, a half a loaf is better than none. Be pragmatic. Those plans for partition did not discuss rights, justice. They discussed practicality. And maybe there was wisdom even in the British, who messed up so badly in so many other places in the world, even as they did in Palestine. Practicality suggested that people believe in their beliefs. What are the arguments, the secular or the theological arguments, that can dissuade people from surrendering or even seriously modifying that which they deeply believe in? So that's essentially the story as I see it. We're at a stage where there's a measure of irony. Zionism, which ostensibly became committed to the secular discourse, finds itself 100 years after Balfour with a leadership that is embracing elements that have deep roots in theology rather than in secular principles. And on the other hand, there has been unanticipated, extraordinary movement among Christians and Muslims to modify their views, which enable accepting secular principles that could come to perhaps some measure of accommodation. So that's the story. It's the chapter. There's another chapter to be written and a chapter after that to be written. This is an unfolding story whose roots go back millennia, whose key events took place 1,600 and 1,300 years ago, whose contemporary political roots took place in 1917, and then in a whole variety of acts before then. When people ask, when does this conflict begin? It begins a long time ago, and with many, many permutations. And all I've tried to do is to try to throw some light on where we are today and the complexities of the issues that confront us. I'll stop here. Can I shut the screen? Good.
Can everybody hear me okay? Good evening, everyone. Let me begin by extending a warm thanks to both Professor Troen for taking the time to speak to us and to the Wiesel Center for the honor of responding to his lecture. Whose Promised Land comes to us at no better time, as the events of October 7th and its global response have intensified our need for understanding a complex and intractable situation. Consistent with his role as a scholar and teacher, Professor Troen systematically takes his reader through the predominant ideas and justifications that underlie the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, and has done so in a way that is even-handed in its analysis, yet is also not afraid to pull any punches in its criticisms. Absent the consolation of easy solutions, the book leaves its reader with the impression not only that there aren't any, but that we also should be wary of those who claim there are. At a moment when such easy answers are often tied to indiscriminate attacks on the very legitimacy of the State of Israel, especially from within the academy itself, Whose Promised Land provides a valuable corrective. In what follows, I offer what I take to be three major implications of this book. Number one, Professor Troen's thesis reintroduces a topic that used to be fairly obvious, but that has been elided by the greater part of recent discourse regarding the conflict, namely the influence of religion. In other words, our failure to comprehend the Middle East and the frustration that arises from its protraction stem in large part from the inadequacy of the fashionable paradigms that we as contemporary observers bring to it. If we reduce this dispute to purely secular frameworks, especially ones that are themselves reductive, we fail to appreciate the extent to which religion continues to function for human beings as a powerful source of identity, a fountain of meaningful ideas, a map for action, and a determinant of value. With this in mind, it is fitting that Professor Troen is visiting us, since stimulation for this book came from meetings of BU's Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs, founded by the late professor of the sociology of religion, Peter Berger, who originally, a major proponent of the secularization theory, came to recognize the persistence of faith in the modern world. Professor Troen extends this insight when he points to examples in which secular logic is either informed by religion or replicates its ways of thinking. The secular, then, does not simply mean the opposite of the religious, but also paradoxically a fundamental indebtedness to it. Number two, our historical context, an interpretive category that is often used to explain and excuse, has to be significantly widened. It has been remarked elsewhere that historical narratives are formed by how far back in the story you go. If we want to better understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Whose Promised Land argues that we cannot start in 2023, 1967, 1948, or even with the decline of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. We must instead begin with Muhammad's first interaction with the Jews of Medina on the Arabian Peninsula. Hostilities reach back to the 7th century CE, as Jews did not simply reject his teachings, but actively sought to prevent his rise. This perceived stubbornness would bear violent consequences, which establish both a quote-unquote holy precedent and a set of attitudes enshrined in Islamic scripture. When we zoom out in this way, we not only better see how the deep past continues to shape the present, but also better see human beings for what they are, not as subjects who fall into neat sociological groupings, but as persons who act and respond to historical events from a variety of motives and causes. Number three, as his title suggests, Professor Troen highlights the central role the concept of promise plays in the Middle Eastern conflict, if not in our social and political world writ large. The power of a promise is something we already know from our interpersonal lives, whether assumed or explicit, between friends, colleagues, spouses, and family members. A promise is a spiritual bond between two entities that sets expectations, opens up future horizons, and commits us to a destiny. When we suspect the promise has been violated, it causes profound disorientation, anger, and distrust. This book examines the different promises that have been made over the course of millennia between gods and peoples, nations and land, between the secular order and the modern world, and the different ways those promises have been fulfilled, acted on, compromised, deferred, and broken. The only entities who have not yet entered into such a bond of promise are the Israelis and Palestinians themselves. And the hope they will get there requires listening, recognition, empathy, patience, and a good deal of interpretive creativity. May we see it soon.